back to the Teach for the Heart podcast, where we tackle teaching challenges from a biblical perspective. Why are we here? Because we don't believe that our spiritual walk and teaching profession should exist in two separate domains. Rather, the hope we have in Christ should change how we approach everything, not just at home, but at school as well. So join us as we explore both the spiritual and practical sides of key teaching challenges, integrating them together so we can succeed at teaching, glorify God, and make a lasting difference in our students' hearts and lives. This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Herzog Foundation. And today I'm excited to talk to you about being consistent in the classroom. I think you all know that's important, but we're going to talk about how to actually make that happen. Before we do that, I want to invite you, if you are enjoying this podcast, would you please subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast player? If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. That really helps us get the word out and make sure that you see all of the new episodes. And we'd also love to hear your review of the podcast. So please feel free to leave that on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you listen. That would also be a great help to us. Today, we're talking about being consistent in the classroom. And I have to say, this was tough for me. And it's something I definitely had to learn. And when I first started teaching, I'll actually give you a little bit of the backstory. I actually had some decent classroom management training when I was in college. However, the school that I did my internship at was kind of, if I'm being honest, a little over the top strict. Now, that is like the opposite problem of most schools face today. But at this time in this school, if a student in high school or middle school talked once in class, they were supposed to get an immediate detention. And for the most part, that is what teachers did. So as a result, there was not a lot of, I will say it kept the classrooms pretty orderly, but I just felt like that was over the top. I did not want to be like that in my own classroom. So I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give a detention every time a kid talks. But what I failed to do was come up with an alternate plan. I said, I'm not going to give a detention, but I didn't figure out what I was going to do instead. So when kids started talking or being disruptive, I didn't really do anything. I've shared this with you before if you've listened to the podcast long. And as a result, I kind of let a lot go. And I wasn't necessarily consistent because I just did not know what to do. And that led to a whole lot of problems. And that's what happens, right? I know I tended to let stuff go because I didn't know what to do. I just kind of didn't deal with it. But I've talked to a lot of you, and sometimes for a lot of teachers, when you don't know what to do, you end up being really inconsistent, right? One time you might let it go. The next time you might come down really hard. Then it's in the middle. Then you just blow up one day because you are just frustrated, right? And so when we don't have a plan, when we don't know how we're going to handle common problems in the classroom, even things as simple as talking, right? Then we tend to be really, really inconsistent with it. And as we talked about before on the podcast, when students see that we're inconsistent, they tend to pounce. Even young students sense this because it's like an unspoken thing. It's this kind of signal that says, I don't really know what I'm doing. You can get away with more. And students can just sense that uncertainty in us. They can sense that inconsistency. And students they're naturally going to push boundaries. That is part of human nature under the fall. They're going to push those boundaries. And if we don't hold the line consistently, then they're not going to know where the line is. It's not going to be clear to them. And as I said, they're going to keep pushing it and keep pushing it often way past where we want it to be. Another problem with being inconsistent is sometimes we do blow up, like I said, right? If we don't have a clear plan and, this time we let it go and so students think, oh, maybe this is fine. And then the next time we come down really hard on it. And then maybe one time we truly do blow our top because we're so frustrated. That obviously can really hurt the relationship. It can create an environment where students don't know what to expect from us. And it feels like we are unreliable. And we definitely don't want that either, right? That does not help build the relationships. So it is so important to be consistent. And I've kind of been beating around this bush, but I want to make the statement here really clearly. A lot of the times, the reason it's so hard to be consistent is because we don't have a plan. We don't know what we're going to do when students do X, talk out of turn, rude to a classmate, don't have their work, whatever it is. We don't have a plan, and so we're reacting in the moment based on whatever pops in our head or whatever mood we're in. And so having a plan really is so key for us to be consistent. It also really helps us avoid both extremes. It helps us avoid those blow-ups because we simply can follow our plan. We don't feel helpless. We have a plan and we can follow it. And then it also helps us avoid that over permissiveness where we kind of let everything go because we don't know what to do, or like I said, or the swings back and forth in between, none of which are good. It helps us be consistent. And when we are consistent, then that boundary line becomes clear and students start to realize, okay, when I step over this boundary, the same thing's going to happen every time. And that builds an environment of trust and an environment where students know what is expected of them. And they might not like it at first, but they do. They really do appreciate that, and they thrive much better in that environment. It reduces disruptions and creates a place where you can actually teach, you can help your students, they can learn, and you can even have fun together with learning with them. So let's talk. So that's a little bit of the background of why we aren't being consistent, why it's so important. Let's talk clearly about how to be consistent. There are 3 keys to being consistent. Number 1 is to create a plan for how you're going to deal with the most common classroom issues. That is number 1. That is so important. We have to have a plan for how we're going to deal with all of our common problems so that when they come, we can follow the plan. So if you've never done that, if you've never sat down, and I really encourage you to actually write it down, because when we have a plan in our head, a lot of times it's actually kind of fuzzy. We're like, yeah, I'll do this, this, and this, but then we might not remember what we said, or we might actually not have as much clarity as we think, because when it's just in your head, you can kind of just gloss over parts of it, and maybe even without realizing it. But when you write it down, it kind of forces you to be like, okay, what am I actually going to do? And then you have that to reference. So it's so valuable to actually write it down. And we actually talked in detail in a recent episode. We talked about it in episode 312. So if you go back to 312 or teachfortheheart.com/312, we talked in detail about the 5 parts of a classroom management plan that we recommend and that we teach on the teachers that we work with in Classroom Management 101 to go through and create. But at the very least, you need to have a plan for when a student, write down the 5 most common classroom issues you face, and write down, this is how I'm going to handle them, okay? And if you don't know what to do, like I said, we'd love to help you in Classroom Management 101. You can also talk to a fellow teacher and admin and put together a plan. So that is number 1. You have to have a plan. This is how I'm going to deal with these common issues, okay? Once you have your plan, step 2 is follow your plan. It's kind of obvious, but it's really, really important. When I say this is what I'm going to do, I now have to make a determination. Okay, I am going to follow my plan. And it helps, at least for me, to predetermine that ahead of time. Because if in the moment I'm debating, that's not good. That's going to lead back to inconsistency. I have to instead say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and be really determined. This is how I'm going to do it. Now, everyone's personality is different, but I'll tell you what I struggled with in this. I struggled to do this, but it's like a muscle. It's like when the more you exercise it, the stronger you get and the easier it becomes, right? So I remember the first time I had to give it attention, I literally called my husband and was like, I needed like a pep talk or something. It was so hard for me. And it still is not easy for me to hold students accountable, to even hold my own kids accountable. I don't like to do it, but I know it's so important. And so if you feel similar to me, you got to just kind of predetermine, this is what I'm going to do, so that in the moment you're not debating. You're just like, no, I already said I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to follow my plan. And it might also help to practice ahead of time. So in other words, literally stand in front of a mirror or get a friend or a coworker or a spouse to practice with you and actually practice saying your response. So, what am I going to do when a student's talking, and actually practice doing it a few times so that you kind of have those repetitions under your belt. So when it comes time to do it in real life, you have that, that helps you be more confident and be like, okay, I already know what to do and ready to do it. So if you are nervous about that or you struggle with that, I definitely do recommend thinking about it, imagining it, and actually practicing it out loud. All right, so let's review. Step 1, create a plan for how you're going to deal with most classroom issues. most classroom issues, pardon me. Number 2, follow your plan when those issues occur. And then this is number 3. This is also very, very important. When you miss a behavior issue, get the next one. Here's what I mean. Let's say that according to your plan, when a student talks without permission, they get a warning, okay? And you have a warning system and all that. But when, you're teaching and you see, George talk, but you didn't do anything about it. You let it go. You missed it. You dropped the ball. Okay. It is going to happen. You need to be determined not to let it happen, but it's still going to happen. Okay. Now here's the mistake I see teachers make. They say, well, I didn't correct George, so now when Alicia is talking, I can't correct her either because that wouldn't be fair. No. That will compound the problem. And I mean, if you don't correct George and Alicia, now you can't correct, and it just snowballs so fast. And there's like no way out of that if you can follow that logic through, on and on. So what you have to do is say, okay, if I miss George, I'm getting the next one. And when Alicia talks, you do exactly what your plan says, okay? You have to imagine yourself getting right back on that horse and just letting that one go, okay? You might say, well, what about, that's not fair. Okay, in a perfect world, you would be fair, but we are not perfect. Only God is perfect in his justice, okay? We are not. So we need to do our absolute best, but we also need to recognize we are not going to be perfect. We are going to mess up, and messing up with one doesn't mean we should mess up with everyone else too. It means get back at it and keep going, okay? And when you do that, that one thing you miss is just a blip on the radar. It's really no big deal. If you let it snowball, it becomes a huge deal. So just recognize I'm gonna miss stuff. I'm gonna mess up. I'm not gonna consistently follow my plan 100% of the time. But when I miss those, if those 1% of misses, as long as I get right back on track, if I'm following it 98, 99% of the time, I'm actually really, really doing good. So don't let those trip you up. And by the way, if you're worrying, well, what if students call me out and say that? You can have kind of a canned response ready. It could be something like, I'm not perfect and I don't catch everything, but I'm doing my best. And that, or I'm doing my best to be as consistent as possible, and just move on. Don't get sucked into a whole debate or a conversation about that. Just keep going. They don't really need a big explanation. All right, so let's review 3 keys to be consistent. Number 1, create a plan for how you'll deal with common classroom issues. Number 2, follow your plan, and it really, really is that simple. Number 3, when you miss a behavior issue, get the next one. So that is how to be consistent in your classroom. But I have one other thing that I would like to talk with you guys about. And that is, we kind of talked about the practical side of this. I want to talk for a minute about the biblical thinking side of this and kind of answer the question, well, what about grace? What about mercy? And honestly, is the right goal biblically to be consistent all the time? Are we even having the right goal from a biblical perspective to say, I'm going to be really consistent? So let's consider this, okay? I'm going to first of all make some cases for why consistency matters biblically, and then we're going to talk about some of the other side of when there's actually times when we shouldn't be consistent, and some biblical principles we can learn from that. So first of all, some thoughts on consistency and some thoughts on how God operates, right? God is the perfect example of both justice and mercy, okay? I alluded to this before, right? God is perfectly just and he is perfectly merciful and gracious, right? And he is the perfect divine blend of both. And he is both love and justice at all times. We, however, are not perfect. We will never, ever get this perfectly right. And we do need to accept that, okay? We will never, ever be perfect. However, we should seek to reflect his heart, right? And to be good ambassadors or representatives of him and the way he cares for us to our students, okay? So we need to recognize that consistent justice is important, but there is place for mercy as well, and there's always love. And we'll talk more about the mercy aspect here in a minute. Another thing as I thought about this was I thought about 1 Corinthians 14:40, which says, let all things be done decently and in order. And in context, that context of that verse is talking about the use of tongues in the church and how it's important that it be orderly and church be orderly. And so I thought about, yes, God is a God of order. We see that in nature. It's explicitly talked about in that verse. And consistency absolutely helps create order in our classroom. And so that is important. We want our classrooms to reflect the orderliness of God and in that way we are reflecting him. So that is, I think, a helpful thing for us to recognize. Consistency also helps to create a fair and a just environment. And it helps to prevent at least partiality or even inadvertent partiality, right? If we're not going off a plan, if we're not consistent, it can be easy, even unintentionally, to favor students over others, right? To kind of let this one go, but to come down hard on this one. And that is not just, right? That's not creating a just environment. And we know that God honors justice. And I hesitate to use the word fairness because that is an entirely other conversation, because just as a quick aside, God is not always fair. If he was fair, we would be dead in our sins, right? He is just and the justifier of those who believe in Jesus. So I don't want to get too lost on the term of fairness, but consistency does help create that just and fair environment. It prevents partiality, and there's so many verses warning us against partiality. One that comes to mind, James 2:9, if you show partiality, you commit sin. Very, very clear. It's talking about in the church, but it applies anywhere. So it really is, consistency really does help us to avoid that partiality, to treat all our students more equally and fairly, and that is a very good thing. It reflects God's character. He does not show partiality, and so we don't want to either. All right, but what about grace and mercy? If we're literally consistent 100% of the time, we would never show a student grace. We would never let a student off the hook. We would never be merciful. What I'm talking about is saying, you deserve this punishment, but I'm not going to give it to you. And that also would not reflect God's character, right? So there is absolutely a place to let students off the hook, to give some grace, to give some mercy. But here is the key. We must do that when it is best for the students. We need to be caring first and foremost for their benefit and for their good. And we also are responsible as teachers to care both for the individual and for the class. So when we're making these decisions, we need to ask what is best for the individual student and what is best for the class. And we need to care about both of those. Now, this is where, once again, we're never going to get it perfect. God is perfect in his decisions. We are not going to be perfect, but we can pray and ask him for help. And like I said, seek to reflect his heart. So what we need to recognize is that in most cases, what is best for both the individual and the class is consistency and discipline. That should be kind of the standard, the normal, the modus operandus, so whatever you want to say, right? That should be the norm, is I'm going to follow my plan. I'm going to be consistent in my discipline. However, we do need to be prepared to offer mercy or grace when it is the best thing to do. And how do we know? Well, we look at what is truly best for the student. And if you're praying, you'll know. Like I said, you won't get it perfect all the time, but you'll know. There's those moments where you see a student trying so hard, they're making so much progress, and technically they fell short and need this consequence, but you're like, that is going to destroy them. And what they really need is encouragement. They don't need me to come down hard right now. They need to all their progress acknowledged. Okay, that would be an example of a situation where you say, nope, I'm not going to give this consequence because this is what's best. But what I want to caution you against, because I know this is how I am, is saying I'm giving grace, I'm giving mercy, when in actuality, It's just that I don't want to deal with it, right? It's almost a cop out for me. I'm just going to give grace so that I don't have to deal with this problem. I don't want to give this consequence. I don't want to have to deal with it. I'm just going to kind of let it go, or I'm going to say I'm giving you mercy. And it's not actually what's best for them. I don't actually have that as my primary motivation. My primary motivation is I don't have time for this. I don't want to deal with this, something like that. So that is my bottom line recommendation, is really just sharing, asking yourself that question, what is truly best for the student? And knowing that the vast majority of the time, it's going to be sticking to your plan, being consistent, letting them experience consequences, right? That is what is normally best for the student. So default there, but do be ready to give mercy and grace on those special, unique times when it is called for. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as we talked about the importance of being consistent. I do want to share with you a couple resources. If you'd like to dive into some of this more with us, we have a new free training called How to Reduce Disruption So You Can Actually Teach. And it's a micro training. It's about 28 minutes long. So if you want some more help with this and kind of more thinking through how do we make a plan, how do we reduce disruptions, go to teachfortheheart.com/free, teachfortheheart.com/free to sign up for that free training. We'd also love to invite you to join us in Classroom Management 101, where we walk you through every single step of creating your plan. There's step-by-step trainings, copy and paste templates, mentor support, and everything there. So if you want more info on Classroom Management 101, go to teachfortheheart.com/CM101, CM101. And of course, all the notes and links can be found at this episode's link, which is teachfortheheart.com/316, teachfortheheart.com/316. Well, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to speaking with you again soon. In the meantime, teacher, remember, God is at work in you and through you, and he's using you to make a difference. Keep your eyes on him and teach for the heart.